welcome to Disconnect, New Mexico Special Episode 5, Navajo and Western Apache Witchcraft. In our last episode of the Witchcraft series, we discussed Pueblo Witchcraft. Today, we'll cover Navajo Witchcraft and Western Apache Witchcraft. Start with Navajo Witchcraft, since it's the larger of the two we'll be talking about today. Navajo Witchcraft is a complicated subject. Unlike other systems we've talked about, like Pueblo or Hispanic Witchcraft, Navajo Witchcraft isn't inherently evil. Only when it is turned against the in-group is it actually evil. Let's start this off by talking about the categories of Navajo witchcraft. To quote Professor Sapir, quote, "The Navajo language is peculiarly interested in categories. It delights to file things away. Vividness and contrast between categories is very important to the Navajo." End quote. In this, Navajo witchcraft is no exception and can be roughly broken into 4 distinct categories. Although we'll occasionally see there is overlap between categories, and depending on where you draw the line and what is actually witchcraft, there can be at least 7 different categories. I'm relying heavily here on the categories Clyde Cluckhorn used in his book Navajo Witchcraft for how I've chosen to divide these categories, although he did offer the following disclaimer. Quote, "It is true that I have not found any single Navajo word which lumps together witchery, sorcery, wizardry, and frenzy witchcraft, so far as conceptual category is concerned. Category witchcraft is probably the observer's and not a native category. I do think that evidence has been presented that the Navajo do treat the separate varieties as a feeling category. In any case, from the standpoint of the observer attempting a structural analysis, there can be no doubt that all of these patterns are crystallized around a common focus, private manipulation of the supernatural for socially disapproved ends. Moreover, there are more explicit elements common to each. For example, the use of the personal name enters in all 4 techniques. As one informant remarked, they used to say you can't witch a person until you know his name." End quote. The first category we'll talk about is witchery. Witches themselves are associated with death and incest. Suspicion of incest is suspicion of witchcraft, and vice versa. Witches can be of any gender, although they are usually men. Elderly people are tended to be more suspected of being a witch, and old women with no children can also be suspected of witches. This is probably linked to Navajo taboos around death. Much like with Pueblo witchcraft, often the sacrifice of a close family member is needed, and in most witch stories, the witch's spouse does not know about the other's activity. Furthermore, witches are considered to be more active at night. Witches themselves often turn to the trade for selfish reasons. Witches meet at night to plan, initiate new members, to have intercourse with dead women, eat human flesh, and kill victims with rituals. Usually, they meet in caves. No witch activity will take place in the home, though. Usually in these caves or fields, they sit with baskets of human flesh. Sometimes rows of heads are stored. It depends on the specific story. They're naked aside from their masks and jewelry, and their bodies are usually painted. There's a head witch that is running the whole show at these gatherings, which Cluckhorn called Sabbaths. Usually witches are considered rich, and they will have a class of menial helpers at these Sabbaths, and these helpers are so poor that they have no other choice but to help the witches to survive. Most of the accounts also agree that songs are sung and colored ash paint made. These are sometimes used as part of the witchcraft, such as a bow being used to fire turquoise beads into the pictures. Other types of witches will also participate in these Sabbaths, as we'll see. A witch's primary tool of the trade is a kind of disease powder. This pollen-like powder is made from corpse flesh, the flesh of children being preferred for this potion. Powder is then administered to the victim. The means of administering it can vary from putting it in food or dropping it through the roof of a hogan to just giving it to a sleeping victim. Witch poison can cause a variety of symptoms. Usually they're pretty drastic. Things like fainting, lockjaw, blackened soul and tongue, sudden unconsciousness, or other dramatic symptoms. Sometimes witches will work together, though this is not a universal. One will inflict the curse, and then the other will heal it. The two will then split the profits from the healing. Like Pueblo and Hispanic witches, they can turn into animals. This is done by wearing the animal's skins, and they use that to aid in their activities. If they're injured in this form, the human body will reflect the wounds that the animal form got. Per Cluckhorn, the wolves are the only universal animal that witches could turn into. Cluckhorn went as far as to report that wolf was a slang term for witch. The next category of witchcraft we'll talk about is sorcery, which is sometimes wrapped into as just another branch of witchery. So to kind of talk about what sorcery is, it's more like an enchantment than anything else. And unlike all the other branches of witchcraft we'll talk about today, animals, especially dogs and whirlwinds, can practice sorcery. Like witches, sorcerers have the ability to turn into animals as well. To actually perform the magic, a piece of the victim's offal or clothing is required. This offering is then buried in a grave or under a lightning-struck tree, and when you bury it under the tree, it's usually buried with grave material. Once this talisman is buried, a chant is said over it listing the number of days until the victim dies. Sometimes the reports of this chant are that it's a good chant from a good ceremonial that is recited backwards to cause maleffects. There are also a few other specific talismans or methods that can be used. One particular one of note is you take a horned toad, you split the belly, and you put talisman inside. That'll allow you to curse a pregnant woman. Sometimes the spell is whispered while stepping over a sleeping victim or a sand painting of the victim. The target doesn't have to be a person either. Sorcery can target anything from material goods like a saddle to a person and animals. They also participate in the Witch's Sabbath, but overall they're considered less dangerous than a straight-up witch. Next we have wizardry. This is a branch of witchcraft that Cluckhorn said was exclusive only to men. Wizards practice shooting magic, which we've talked about extensively in our last episode on Pueblo Witchcraft. But to go over it again, an object is placed in something. Among the Navajo, it's a tube, a basket, or a bag, and then you do an incantation over it. This allows the object to make it float and fly into the victim at high speeds. Once the victim is cursed in this way, they die shortly thereafter unless cured. This death is usually caused by emaciation. Just like among the Pueblos, sucking the object out is the cure. We described this in the Pueblo Witchcraft episodes, and the Pueblos are commonly relied on to help provide this treatment. Unlike witches and sorcerers, wizards cannot become an animal, and they do not participate in the Sabbath. Finally, of the branches we'll talk about in depth, you have frenzy witchcraft. Of the 4 branches, frenzy witchcraft is sometimes put into a larger, what Cluckhorn called the prostitution way, and is the most on its own of the 4 I'm going to talk about. At a high level, this grouping of magic is mostly about causing a lost state of mind. This is your love magic, your gambling magic, the stuff you use to make sure you get better deals when trading, manipulating the human mind, basically. Divination also will fall into this category. This is where they use things like the datura plant. The plant use is what makes this branch of magic unique. Overall, there appears to have been some kind of larger complex around frenzy witchcraft, including something that Cluckhorn called the prostitution way chant, which was some kind of socially approved cure for this kind of magic. At least back when he was doing his research in the field, he couldn't find that it still existed, though some of his informants did wrap that prostitution way chant into the greater blessing way ceremonial complex. Unlike other groups, practitioners of the frenzy witchcraft are not associated with death, and they do not participate in the Witch's Sabbath. Usually a victim is affected by food, a cigarette, or a simple touch. The victim then goes under the effects of the witchcraft. Effects of this witchcraft can be from small amounts of desire for someone out to completely obsessive love. Again, it can be used to get better gambling results and better trades by making the affected somehow lose control in some way. And overuse by a practitioner can lead to certain negative effects. That's kind of it for the high-level categories of witchcraft I wanted to talk about in this episode. There's also 3 or 4 others that exist that Cluckhorn identified that he didn't have a lot. I couldn't find a lot of details. This includes disease witchcraft. This is sorcery, but mostly aimed at animals. Practitioners of disease witchcraft were noted not to participate in the Witch's Sabbath. Eagle pit sorcery, which appears to be a more dangerous form of sorcery, and it seems to be linked with the Eagle Way chants, but it might be part of a greater woman's piece of wood or woman's song complex as well. Cluckhorn didn't have a good feeling for exactly what this kind of witchcraft was. Let's move into how the Navajo protect themselves from witchcraft. So the high-level protections are obviously just ceremonials and ceremonial goods. Gall medicine is also another good one, especially if it comes from certain animals. It's particularly effective against witchcraft. And then there's a handful of other cures that are sometimes cited, such as doing work over sand paintings, certain plants, or talking rock medicine. All of these are just different forms of potential cures, or potential protections. As far as for cures, there's a variety of methods. Like in the Pueblos, the confession of a witch may cause it to reflect from the afflicted to the witch itself, which would cause them to waste away. Like the Pueblos, certain forms of witchcraft are considered a capital offense, and if you kill the witchcraft goes away. Sometimes a caught witch will offer up a cursed object, and if you refuse the cursed object, when you've caught them, the witch will then be caught under the curse that they were trying to inflict on you. Ceremonials and chants can sometimes be cures, but sometimes certain ceremonials and chants in certain circumstances can actually make things worse. Depending on the type of witchcraft you're afflicted by, certain plants can also be used as a cure, and then there's obviously specific cures for specific circumstances. Overall, witches usually operate alone against a single victim. We did discuss sometimes they're cited as kind of running this racket where one witch curses someone else cures it, and then they split the profits. but overall they're usually considered of operating alone outside of the Sabbath. Certain groups among the Navajo have been considered in Cluckhorn's research to have more witches than others. This seems to be culturally distinct regions within the Navajo. As far as learning the trade, witchcraft is almost exclusively taught. For wizardry, sorcery, and witchery, the process is almost always the same. A neophyte witch will pay some amount up front or somehow be brought to a witch's Sabbath. It depends on the specific story being told, obviously. From here, they will learn the trade, but eventually a higher price will have to be paid, and that is the death of a close relative. Usually a sibling is chosen. For frenzy witchcraft, it has a bit of a different training method. A potential practitioner hires the existing one to prepare the needed plants. Students collect both the plants for this and the potential cures, so that the student will then prepare a piece of fry bread and a hole will be punched in it. The teacher will chew the plants and spit them into the student's mouth through the hole in the fry bread. The student is then watched over by the teacher who will administer the cure as needed. After this, the student can practice without fear, as long as they don't take prolonged breaks from their use of the plants. That's all I had planned for Navajo witchcraft. I want to shift gears and talk about Western Apache witchcraft, as there's some overlap between the two methods. There's cultural similarities between the Navajo and Apaches, both being Athabascan speakers. I've narrowed my scope quite a bit to just Western Apache witchcraft because that was the only one where I could find really good, solid, scholarly resources on the subject. Western Apaches are in the region of Arizona, and it's really several groups of Apaches lumped together. For the remainder of this episode, when I say Apache, I'm really just referring to this group Western. From what I was doing for my research, I found that Apache witchcraft kind of has a bigger small town gossip feel to it. It's kind of the witches kind of hang around at night and eavesdrop. You know about witchcraft, that means you're obviously a witch. And furthermore, usually it's grudges against individuals, right? I have a grudge against you, so I'm going to curse you so you die. You know, it's a much more, again, it's kind of that like small town gossip. They're all getting together and they're all gossiping about how so-and-so's got really sick after he ticked off so-and-so. And so now clearly so-and-so's a witch, right? That's kind of the feel behind the witchcraft from my research. Before we get into actual practices though, we'll need to talk a little bit about the Apache worldview to kind of explain how witchcraft works. I'm going to use the English translation so that I don't mangle Western Apache. So at the highest levels, the Apache divide their worlds into 4 categories. Can it move on its own? This would be things like people, which they divide into further groups, automobiles, flora, which they break into several different categories, flying bipeds, which are also divided into subcategories, cold-blooded quadrupeds that are eaten, and the quadrupeds that aren't eaten. The next highest category is things that need an outside force to move. These would be things like your mountains, rivers, or valleys, your topographical features, as well as certain material goods. Then they have holy items. So this would be your ceremonial goods and other holy items. People themselves can also be broken down a different way than the categories that the Apache already have, and that's those who have power and those who don't. Power itself is kind of hard to pin down. It's some kind of invisible thing that people can obtain. And when you have this supernatural thing, you can practice witchcraft or you can become a medicine man. Power itself can be broken down into 21 or so different categories. These all center around different phenomena or things. You might have something like water or rain power, or it might be bat power or mountain lion power. And that's just kind of how you can define what this specific kind of power is kind of used for. As mentioned before, both medicine men and witches can use power, so let's cover what the differences between a medicine man and a witch are really. Medicine men can use power in public, they can employ chants, they can make sand paintings, and they use their powers to cure. A witch, on the other hand, will do none of those things. Instead they perpetrate sickness, death, and certain insanities. Medicine men can become witches, but when a medicine man becomes a witch, he can no longer practice his trade in public. Medicine men specifically are classified by the kind of power they have. So this would be something like a bear medicine man. Witches can be broken into really 2 categories. Sorcerer is a bad term for it, but you essentially have sorcerer and love witch. Witch and sorcerer use the same word in Apache, but it's different context between witch as a category versus witch as an individual. A witch usually practices both love magic and sorcery, and it's used for different cases. Let's start with love magic since it's a little easier to talk about. Love magic and love witches do love magic, which is usually directed against those of the opposite sex. Frequently, a love witch is incestuous as well. Though there are situations among the Apache where love magic is bad, such as when it's a weak amount of love magic that you use to make more friends or attract a lover. It becomes evil when it's used to the extreme. So when you use it to such a degree that you drive someone insane with desire. Outside of that, there's not a whole lot to talk about with love magic, so let's move right into sorcery. It's more common than love magic, and men usually become sorcerers, since one of the prerequisites is that you must feel intense hatred, and men are considered to feel hatred more intensely than women. To learn witchcraft, you have to learn it from an experienced practitioner. Usually this will be a close maternal kinsman, someone within your clan. Usually it costs a lot to learn, though. Sorcerers are more active at night and like to go to well-attended ceremonies where they can practice their craft in secret, and their footprints may be found near burial grounds or near the homes of their victim. They are extremely difficult to identify. Unlike other Native American groups we've talked about, the Apache witch doesn't have the ability to transform into an animal. Both kinds of witches, though, will meet at night for offensive activities and dances. Usually their dances start in caves, but sometimes a large enough spot of open ground is used. They start a bonfire and they dance naked around the fire, with remains of corpses above their heads. As the dance dies off, a witch may have intercourse with a menstruating woman, if he so chooses. Usually this is with a close maternal kinsman. The fluid from this activity is then collected and is later used as an ingredient in poison. These are not a necessary part of the initiation always, though, unlike among certain Navajo stories that were reported. Sorcery can be broken down into 3 broad categories. Let's go through each in turn. The first one we've got is poison sorcery, which is very similar to what we see with Navajo. A poison is made from various ingredients, powdered human skin being a primary one. It is then administered to a victim who quickly wastes away. It can be administered to the victim either by administering it to them when they're asleep, spiking their food, or by throwing it into the house. Very similar to what we saw among the Navajo. Usually the poison, though, is employed against groups and not just a single individual. The next is spell sorcery, and this is a little more complicated. But at a high level, an incantation is repeated or thought 4 times, wishing harm against another. This will usually requires knowledge of their Apache name, and sometimes you'll include something like part of a chant backwards. The spell can be enhanced through a few various ways, such as walking around the victim 4 times. You commonly do that at a ceremonial, which is one of the reasons why witches like to attend ceremonials. Circling their dwelling 4 times, placing 4 pieces of wood at each cardinal direction around the victim's home, burying some object, usually wood or stone, in the ground near their dwelling, or somewhere near where the victim likes to drink or relive. Just like with the Navajo, though, as far as spell sorcery is concerned, humans aren't the only target, and even material goods can be targeted. Finally, is shooting magic, which we've already talked about twice now. I don't think I need to go over it again. All forms of sorcery cause sorcerer's sickness. This is a disease that comes on suddenly and causes various symptoms from paralysis to faint. Those who die from the sickness should have swollen tongues, bluish cheeks and necks, and they should decompose extremely quickly. Turquoise beads, cattail pollen, and eagle breast feathers can help provide protection. Other methods are sometimes also mentioned. Bear, snake, and lightning ceremonials are performed to combat the work of sorcery. Gone ceremonies, which I think I'm pronouncing correctly, can also sometimes be performed, but are usually prohibitively expensive to help with witchcraft. Let's talk about some of the criteria to do witchcraft on someone. Witchcraft can't be used against just anyone. You can't use it against people of your own clan, for instance. It simply kills the witch if you even try to do that. Furthermore, the witch must be of a certain age. This is considered mature adulthood, so this would be somewhere between 30 and 36. Once you've hit this age and you're older than that, you're good to go, though. Intense hatred is needed to witch someone. The best way to shake a witchcraft accusation is to, quote, have many friends. I think we'll wrap it up here for now, but we're not done yet. Next week, we'll have one final episode on witchcraft, talking about some of the various witchcraft trials that have happened in New Mexico over the centuries.
If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled engineeringfire.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. And thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.